consensus-based, which means that every country is important. But on the other hand, they also have this green room negotiation. By invitation only a very small number of the countries will be invited. And the idea is that given the large number of the WTO members, it's very difficult to reach consensus. So among the key members, a very small group of core members, they have to reach the consensus before the negotiation will be expanded to a larger membership. And the Quad countries in the past were the US, European Union, and Japan, Canada. And the Quad in Doha round negotiation before 2007, US, EU, India, and Brazil. So India and Brazil were the leaders of the developing countries coalitions in the Doha negotiation before 2007. And only since July 2008, China was invited for the first time to the Green Room. So at first, of course, when I interviewed the Chinese negotiators, they said they were excited. They thought, okay, finally, they got the invitation. But then immediately they realized the only reason, different from Brazil and India, and the only reason for China to be invited to the Green Room was that the US realized without China making more concessions, they couldn't get a balanced or a balanced package that everyone will be happy. So the only purpose of inviting China is to pressure China to open up its market. And so that has put China into a very different challenge compared to India and Brazil in the Doha negotiation. I'm not going to go to the details of China's position in the Doha negotiation, but only want to say that if we look at China's position compared to other BRICS countries, I'm not talking about Russia, Russia is too new here, but especially South Africa, India, and Brazil. Okay. And they do share lots of common interests, which is to challenge the developed countries to make sure that the developed countries will remove the trade barriers and all developing countries will benefit for the greater access to their markets. But if we look at in terms of specific national interests, it's very different. So how to manage the difference actually is the biggest challenge, both in the WTO and also in the G20. If the BRICS countries can effectively work together and collectively. Here, if we look at the average tariffs for the non-agricultural manufacturing products, China's tariff is much lower than most of the developing countries, and it's at about a similar level of the developed country. And same thing for the bound agriculture tariff. China's is much lower than most of the developing countries. So on the one hand, in the Doha negotiation, China will insist to stay with other developing countries' coalitions in the G20, but on the other hand, the real interest of China is really to see India and South Africa and the other developing countries to lower their tariffs, because China also wants to export to their market. So very different agenda here. And China and BRICS in the G20, this is the second case study in my paper. And G20 now has become a major forum for economic matters, as mentioned by Natalia. And one thing is that China lacks its G20 platform a lot compared to G7, G8, because China has refused many times the invitation to attend the G7, G8, but also China hated this idea of G2. And China thought that was really the conspiracy of the US to blame China for everything in the global governance issues, be the trade, IMF, and the climate change negotiation. And the only reason to bring China to this G2 idea is to force China to make greater concessions. But the G20 has half of the members being the developing countries. China feels more comfortable there. But on the other hand, very similar to the WTO, there is, it's really hard to balance between, on the one hand, the emerging economies, including China, you want to be more important, but on the other hand, you don't want to sacrifice, you don't want to commit to those shared objectives and to make the domestic policy adjustments. And one thing that China has been very reluctant to attend the G20 meeting is every time of the summit, China will be asked to undervalue, to do something to its undervalued currency. And because the undervalued currency of China has been argued by many economists as one major cause for the current global imbalance. And the only way, to correct the imbalance is for China to export less and consume more, import more. And of course, if we think about at the beginning, I was talking about China's GDP growth was mainly driven by China's exports. So its high dependence on trade, different from other large economies. China's trade dependence is over 60%. And if that's the case, it's not easy for China to give up its currency. But this is also the issue not only between the US and China, but also if you think about the current account problem of India and Brazil, they also share the similar interest with the United States. They don't want China to continue its currency policy, and they don't want China to continue its trade policy, because China's surplus means other countries' deficit. So in order to correct the deficit issue, I think that is very important. And the other issue is the reform of the IMF. And I don't think I have time to talk about that. But this is just a figure to show who are the deficit countries and who are the surplus countries. And China holds the largest surplus. It holds the largest foreign reserve. Actually, China's foreign reserve is 1/3 of the world total, so that has become an issue frequently brought in the G20. All right, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you at this meeting, and particular thanks to Professor Wei on my right for setting the ground so nicely for what I'm going to attempt to do. You'll see, well, firstly I'm Michael Kahn, you can see that up there, and I work in association with the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at the University of Stellenbosch in Cape Town. What you'll see is not present in the top slide is the name South Africa. So I'm not focusing primarily on South Africa. I'm interested in the BRICS in relation to Africa. And of course you can't talk about that without talking about South Africa, because without that relationship I wouldn't be in this room. I'm particularly interested in the interaction between resource nationalism and the prospects for research and innovation. And why I refer to Professor Wei is that technological deepening is absolutely essential to Africa's future, and to not merely counteract deindustrialization, but also to engage with new industrialization, and furthermore to address the other agendas which haven't been spoken about in the meeting so far, that are very close to Eduardo Viola's interests, namely climate change and energy. And without the scientific expertise in country, you cannot really hope to do that. So that's a very quick summary of what's in the paper. The paper has been made available to the conference, and I obviously can't go into all the details in it, but I will try to race through in almost the last session. The starting point has to be the state of Africa, the state that Africa is in summary form, from the scramble for Africa driven by the Congo Conference of 1885 to the first genuine liberations after the European Civil War of 1914 to 1945. So, we have the African liberation movements beginning in the late 1950s in a very complex environment where what are generated, in a sense, are states without nations. And the conflicts that that generates perpetuate to the day. So on top of a normal, in inverted commas, developmental agenda, you have the problem of ongoing secessions. They were spoken about by Shashma, but South Sudan, what's happening in Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, and so on, are driven by the decisions taken by the great powers back in 1885. What made things worse, of course, was the Cold War, and coming through that period, as the new elites took shape in liberated countries, what Asamoah and Robinson referred to as extractive political and economic institutions. In the attempt to find a developmental model, status solutions were generally adopted with the nationalization of the commanding heights of economies, such as they existed, and a very limited role for the private sector, and that persists to the present. We then get to the Lagos Plan of Action of the Organization of African Unity, 1980, and there we detect the first really strong statements about resource nationalism and a commitment to import substitution, industrialization. If you go back to that document, what's very interesting to me, and perhaps to yourself as a sociologist of science, is the enormous presence of the language of science in that document. And more than half the document is about science and technology for development. It's almost as if it provided a way of escaping from the overarching ideological conflicts, and one could simply fill the pages with something more neutral. We then get a period which one may describe as the lost years, where the growth that had been achieved immediate post-independence evaporates, and you see on the graph very, very easily, average GDP per capita plunges, and it only begins to take off as China